Hi everyone, this is Greg Benz with another Photoshop tutorial. In this video, I want to show you how you can combine multiple exposures manually in Photoshop and deal with problem areas like these trees that can often have messy edges to the mask and clean them up using the Refine Mask tool in Photoshop to get a nice, beautiful, finished result like this. In this edit, I combine these original exposures to get this finished image. However, in this tutorial, I want to focus specifically on the Refine Mask tool in Photoshop. It's a very complicated tool, and I want to spend some time with it to really explain how it works and why you would use the various different options within it, whether you're working with luminosity masks like I am in this case, or other general selections. You could apply this in a number of ways. So this is just going to be a general overview of the Refine Mask tool. So first, in this image here of this seascape, I have two exposures I want to blend. I have this background, much darker exposure, and then underneath it I have a much brighter exposure. It's actually 3 stops lighter to get all the details here in this large rock. Now, because they are 3 stops apart, I typically would not blend this way. I would typically keep my exposures no more than 1 stop apart and just use more images. However, because it's backlit, there's really just kind of this pixel boundary between the different areas. There's nothing really to blend between, so I can get away with doing a pretty extreme blend. So it'll look fine in this case. Now the first thing I need to do is create a selection to knock out the black silhouette in this rock and let the brighter exposure shine through. So we could do that by using the quick select tool in Photoshop. Just simply click and drag around the sky. And in doing so, we very quickly have a pretty good selection of the rock and the trees here. But if we zoom in, of course, we're going to see that there's a lot of sky areas of these trees that aren't selected. I could go in and start adding those. I could make sure I start fixing some of the missing parts of these branches, and it wouldn't take me that long to get a good selection. Honestly, probably only 10 or 15 seconds, but I prefer to use luminosity mask for this type of situation. So I'm going to use Lumenzia and create a darks 2 mask. You could use whatever your favorite application is for creating luminosity masks. Channel-based masks. If you are, note that I'm using the levels adjustment here to create a custom curve in Lumenzia because the darks mask doesn't have the separation I want. So I'm moving the gamma on the levels to create a nice separation between the sky and the rock, and then I'm just going to bring in the white slider to make sure the rock is fully selected. So I've got a nice selection. It's not exactly the selection I want because of course there's a lot of sky I don't need in some of this foreground, but that will be easy to deal with. So I'm just going to take this and apply it to this layer. So I'm putting my luminosity mask onto the darker exposure, and as we can see, I have inverted it. So let's flip this. So I just hit Command I to invert. So now we're showing through the sky and of course parts of the foreground that we don't want to show from below. So let's fix that. I'm going to alt click on the mask so we can just see it. And I'm going to grab my gradient tool, and what I want to do is just make everything down below be white. So I'm going to draw a quick gradient here, and I'd like to do this in a couple of phases just to get a feel for how this is landing. And I'm just trying to knock this out and get rid of other parts of this that I don't need because I just need the rock, and I'm going to do this on the sky here a little bit. So at this point we've got a pretty darn good selection of the rock, and I think that's going to work. But we're going to run into some issues pretty quickly here. So even though that's a generally pretty good selection, when we zoom in, we're going to see a couple of things. As we look around the rock edges here, actually looks pretty good in this area. A lot of times this can be a little bit messy in these edges. These came out pretty good. We're seeing some edge issues here. Now it's starting to get a little ugly. You wouldn't notice this on the web, but this is the kind of thing that if you print, you're not going to be happy with the result. You do need to deal with this. I know it's kind of pixel peeping. And then we get up to the trees. This is just a total mess. Obviously, that's not the way we want the trees to look. So we need to fix that. And really the best way to do that is going to be the Refine Edge tool in Photoshop. Now, if you're using Lumenzia, you can just click on Edge to get there, or otherwise in Photoshop, just go up to your selection menu and click Refine Mask. And you're going to get this dialog with a number of different options. And as I said before, it is kind of overwhelming. There's a lot of things you can do with Refine Mask, but let's just break it down. There's essentially four major areas of refine mask. The first is view mode. These are just different ways of previewing what you're going to do to the image. None of these options in the view area actually change the result. They just show you something different while you're looking at this dialog box. Next is the edge detection. This is essentially the smarts of Refine Edge. This is where a lot of the magic happens. I'll explain this in a minute. It's a smart tool. It's also the most confusing part of the tool. Next is the Adjust Edge. These are some pretty dumb tools that don't really consider the underlying pixel data, just the mask itself, but they're also very helpful. And then lastly, in the output area is Decontaminate Colors, which can be useful for dealing with fringes, especially if you're shooting portraits on a background and you want to knock them out of the background. This can be a great way to clean up halo edges. So let's just kind of go through these one by one. Starting with the view mode, if you click on this, you'll see a number of different options. I can see marching ants that show me the selection. I can see an overlay, essentially kind of a quick mask type of view. I can see on black or on white, which is going to basically show me this layer as if it was sitting above a white or black layer. This is a great way to see what things are going to look like if you're doing compositing of a person onto a different background. And then the next two are really the ones that I think are most relevant. Black and white, this is going to show you the mask. You see these are the same, so this is your live view of the mask. And then on layers is essentially previewing whatever you do here, what will it look like when you hit OK. So this is your live preview. Reveal layer is showing the actual underlying layer without any mask. So if we remove this mask, this is what's underneath. So again, the black and white, this is your mask. On layers, that's a preview of the finished result. So let's just stick with this right here. Next, we have Show Original, which is just a before and after. We haven't done anything yet, so it's not going to show anything. And Show Radius, which is going to help us see this next part in edge detection. So let's get into that. So if I hit Show Radius, we won't see anything at first because we don't have a radius. But as soon as I increase this to some number above 0, Photoshop is going to go and look for edges in the image. It's automatically finding the high contrast areas of the mask and outlining them. And then whatever this radius value is, which is shown here in white, all of those areas are going to be refined. So the edge detection tool only works in the areas that show up white when you're viewing the show radius here. Now if I increase my radius, I'm increasing the area that is going to be adjusted. We see this little spinning wheel. It shows that Photoshop is working as we change the settings here. So the more we move the radius, the more that we're telling Photoshop it's okay to look even further from the selected or detected edge to make changes. Now in this case, we can see it's selecting a ton of the image. And what it's going to do is the areas that are previewed here, it's using the underlying image data to refine the mask. So it's using the mask to find the edge, but then it's using the image data to refine the mask. So let's go and look at the mask here. So if we had back to, let's turn off our show radius so we can just see the image. So here is kind of the original unadjusted original mask. And as we bring up the radius, and I'm going to do some extreme changes to show what's happening here, it's going to grind away. And you see it's starting to fix some of these edge areas. And I'm just going to take it to an extremely high value. And you'll start to see it bite into edges of the mountains here. It's a little bit faint, but it is looking within the image and pulling out a lot more detail. And if we just look at our before and after, we can see in the before, things were very hard edge because I had made those levels adjustments. It was a pretty extreme mask. And after, there's a lot more subtlety to the mask, and it's brought in a lot more of that background of the trees. Now, if we view a preview of our output here, so here was kind of before and after our change. So we haven't actually improved the image in this case, but oftentimes the radius can be a very helpful tool, and it's not going to help you when you use such an extreme value. You just need to increase this enough to capture the areas of detail. So a small amount can go a pretty good way, but for issues such as trees or hair on people, going a little bit larger is helpful. The problem with increasing this radius is if we look at an area like this where there's just kind of one pixel of problems versus here, the problems really extend quite a ways away from the radius edge. And I'll just show that radius again. You need a different radius. You want a large radius here and a small radius here, because what you don't want to do is start adjusting parts of the rock or the sky that get away from that edge. And so there's a couple ways you can do that. Photoshop gives you this smart radius option, and if you turn that on, Photoshop will try and use different radiuses in different parts of the image. Now, it won't actually do anything until you get above 10 pixels. So even though it's turned on, the algorithm doesn't do anything until we get above the 10 mark. So let's take a look at our radius. And so we can see more extreme examples. We move the radius up. So we can see some level of difference. These areas here are a little bit wider than these areas here because these are a little bit more kind of straight and these are a little bit more chaotic. But as you can see, it's not making a huge difference. I don't usually find that Smart Radius really gives me the kind of variability I want. By the time it's going to capture all this tree detail, it's usually just kind of blown away the mountain edges, the building edges, or whatever that simple line is you're trying to preserve. So I don't use this as often. What I like to do instead is bring my radius down to something that's going to work on these thin lines here, and then use this built-in brush tool that we see here. So there's the refine radius tool, which is the brush, and the erase, which is going to undo that. You can actually just always leave things on the brush and then hold Alt to get to the eraser. So if we want to paint in extra areas that we want to adjust, and I'm going to use bracket keys to adjust this here, we literally can just paint, and we're telling Photoshop, despite whatever you found with a radius, go look in these areas that I've painted. And we're going to see that this now, in the radius preview, everything is lit up. So this whole area is being adjusted, even though we have a very small radius everywhere else. So I would simply paint over these areas. Now, a lot of times you wouldn't be looking at show radius, and you're just going to see something like this. But if we go and take one of these trees, and I'm just going to simply paint over it with our brush tool, it's going to start to consider all that detail and try and fix it. And I think that's a little bit better. Usually with hair, it does a great job. With something like these trees, it's not always going to work that well. And the reason that it's not working in this case is this background exposure is so much brighter or so much darker than the foreground exposure. So I'm going to cancel out for a second, and I'm going to hide our mask so we can just take a look at things. If we look at the difference between these exposures in depth, it's not just that the tree is brighter in the exposure below. The pixels actually creep inward. Look at the edge here between these exposures. It's moving considerably, and that's essentially blooming of the highlights in the brighter exposure. So that's just a function of how a digital camera captures an image, and unfortunately that means that the mask that matches the sky in one image does not match perfectly the mask in the other image, and that's why we see halos. So for example, if we look at the edge of the rock here, looking between the two, we can see that this is going to move by a couple of pixels. So this is a very common issue when you have a backlit landscape, that things aren't going to match, and you need to address that, and the Refine Mask tool will let us do that. So let's go back into that, and I'm going to again turn on the radius a bit, just a few pixels to be able to deal with some of these edges here, and you can see that that did actually help. So looking before and after the Refine radius here, let me just zoom in. So here is the original, and we've cleaned things up a bit. It's definitely not perfect, but it did get better. So it is helping to use the radius. So I want to use just enough radius for the rocks, and now the tree areas I want to hit with the Refine tool. Usually it does a pretty good job, so I'm typically going to do this. Now, as you paint, it's important to note that you cannot simply just erase to go back to the radius. So if I show our radius here, if I go to the eraser tool, which I can get to by just holding the Alt key, and we'll see the center of this tool switches from a plus to a minus. If I use the eraser tool, I'm not going to, when I let go, I don't get a radius again. There is no radius to restore here. There's no way to bring that back. So when you use the paintbrush tool, you are destructive to the radius. So if you ever wanted to get that radius back, really the only thing you can do is Control or Command Z on the very last brush stroke. If you did a couple of brush strokes, then unfortunately you're gonna have to cancel and start over. So just be careful with that. If you're using Lumenzia, the restore button will help you get around that limitation by letting you kind of paint back some history if you need to. But in general, just be careful of that. And so let's go, and there's that one last grouping of trees. Let's make sure we get this selected here. So that's going to be refined, and I'm going to hit these little details here. So like I said, that improved things, but it didn't fix our issue. So we're going to go beyond into the adjust edge tools here, and these are basically going to take the output from edge detection and modify it. So let's look at our mask. So we're going to start by playing with smooth, and I'm just going to bring it up to an extreme value, and notice what happens in straight areas versus the more rough areas here. The smooth tool is going to take these areas that are already relatively smooth. It's just going to take care of those little fine details. But in the areas that are very chaotic, lots of change, it's really going to try and smooth those out. From a photography standpoint, I don't have any use for the smooth tool ever. I always leave this off. I'm sure it's great for graphic design and some other uses, but for photography, I have yet to see a place where it makes a lot of sense. Next is feather. This is very helpful, and it's going to do a few different things for us. So let's go and look at the actual image and zoom in here a bit to just make sure we can see the details. So the reason you would use a feather, so actually let me just show the feather. Feather is basically Gaussian blur. If I take the feather up, it's going to take everything and just kind of annihilate it. It doesn't have any intelligence at all. It just does literally a Gaussian blur. But that's still useful because when you're looking at the pixels in your image, there's no pixel that is discretely mountain or sky at the edge. There's always going to be a little bit of a transition where one pixel is sort of sky, sort of mountain, or maybe things are shining through part of the tree or part of hair or even something translucent. And so what you really want to do is blur things just a little bit at the edges to basically take care of that aliasing effect. So I'm going to show the layer here, and then we will just take the feather up, and a little bit goes a very long way here. So that was just a small amount of feathering. We can see here's before, where, let me zoom in, really see this detail here. You can see a very rough looking edge, and as I take this feather up just to 1 or 2 pixels, it really improves that edge considerably. Now if I push it too far, we start getting haloing as it's starting to blur from one to the other. So there is a limit on what you want, and generally speaking, I would say less than 2 pixels is a pretty good choice for feathering. It's not often that I would go to much higher values than that, but that has helped. Now we still have a little bit of some residual issue at the edge here, and that's because of that image area I showed before, where the bright image, actually the highlights extend further in than they do in the shadow image. So we need a way to align these, and we're going to do that by using Shift Edge. Now I skipped over contrast. Let me show that for a second. Contrast is also another tool I don't use. Contrast is simply going to sharpen the mask. So as I bring this up, so we move from kind of a gradiated edge to a much, much sharper edge. Again, I'm sure there's some use for that, but in photography, I don't really know what that would be. So let's come back here to the Shift Edge, and Shift Edge is going to move our mask in or out as we slide it positive or negative. So if I start moving this positive and watch that edge, you can see it got a lot darker. It started to align much better. So I just need to find the right amount of shifting, and that looks like it matches pretty well. I could keep playing with that a little bit more. I think that looks great. I'm actually not going to use this full blend. I'm going to diminish it a little bit, so that is plenty good. I could keep playing with the Shift Edge to get exactly what I want, but I really don't need it. Lastly, I didn't talk about decontaminate colors, but if you turn this on, essentially what it's going to do, it's going to try and find areas of color mismatch and fix them. This would be common if you had someone shot against a green screen and they got a little bit of green showing up in blonde hair, or things like that, or even just black and white issues. It doesn't have to be color. So if you see fringing when you're cutting something out, just try and turn this on. The problem with Decontaminate is it's going to force you to a new layer. It's a destructive choice. So generally speaking, I try to avoid using this. You can always use a separate layer clipped to this if you want to paint over later and get the same effect. That's sort of another topic for another video, but take a look at Decontaminate, see if it helps you. But like I said, try to avoid it if you can, because it is relatively destructive. So just to kind of recap things, we added a little bit of a radius to deal with our more straight edges. Then we use our paintbrush to deal with areas such as these trees. We then added a little bit of feathering to kind of smooth the edges. A little bit is usually a very good thing to do. And then we shifted our edge to deal with the fact that there isn't perfect alignment of the highlights because our exposures are so different. And I'm just going to say okay. And Photoshop has already put those changes onto that layer. And I'm just going to hit Command Z a couple times to show. Here was before and after. Zoom in here. The before, where things just really look pretty terrible here, a lot of weird ghosting, and after, where things look much, much better in this exposure. So that is how I use the Refine Mask tool to essentially blend something in. So here was our original darker exposure. I want to black this mask out, and we've brought through this detail in the rock here. Now this has kind of an HDR look to it. It's just too much of a lightening effect here. It's a +3 stops, so you want to diminish that. And an easy way to do that when you're creating a hole to mask through, just double click the mask and you'll see this density option. Essentially, as you drop the density, the black areas of the mask are going to become more gray. So you can bring this down, and it's going to allow you to just bring through as much of the underlying layer as you want. So just play with the density to get the amount of lightening that you want. So that was the Refine Mask tool, but I did promise to show you how I blended the image overall, so let's take a look at that. So this is my full set of layers that I used. So we have, again, on the bottom here, our original image. I threw a curve on it in order to bring out much more contrast in the rock and make it more interesting. Now, this is an extreme adjustment, but again, because we're only letting some of it through in the next layer, it's fairly diminished. So here was the original, and then when I added this adjustment, brought a lot more detail back to the rocks. Next up, I didn't like these waves as much as I liked them from another image, so I brought them in here. The problem with this image was there's a little bit of motion in the rock and trees because a wave hit my tripod before it was really cemented in, and unfortunately it's a little bit soft, so I couldn't just use this exposure. I had to use both of these. Next, I wanted to get rid of this little bit of lens flare here and this light on this wave here, so I just did a little bit of cloning, very, very minor. Then I wanted to bring in this sun here. This image that I shot here, the sun had just peeked behind the rock. It was moving very quickly, but just moments before I shot this where I had a great burst of the sun. So I really liked that, wanted to bring that back, just added that as a lightened layer and just painted it in the mask. Then I did some dodging and burning in Lumenzia to bring out more color here in the rocks and the sun. I used a midtones mask and a contrast adjustment to bring out more detail in the waves. And similarly, I made some adjustments to the sky. So I used a Zone D in Lumenzia applied to a curve, and then did a secondary mask to just limit that to the sky. So here's before and after to bring out more detail in the clouds. Then I created a vibrance mask to bring back more of the yellow tones and really add a lot of warmth to the image. And then finally did a vignette in Lumenzia. I used a not D mask, that is everything that's not dark, and a vignette. So that's going to give me a vignette but protect the shadows. And so you see that vignette there. So overall, pretty complex edit, but just a few little things in there that I think are important tweaks, and that Refine Mask tool is really the key to dealing with tough issues such as trees on a rock like this. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos like it, as well as to my free newsletter at gregbenzphotography.com. Thanks.